Picture a farmhouse table in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. January, sometime in the 1930s. The windows are black with cold, and the wood stove in the corner is the only reason anyone in that room can feel their hands. On the table, a pot so heavy 2 people carried it from the stove. There are jars of pickled beets and apple butter, a board of dark bread, a pitcher of cold milk, and there are dishes, 20 of them across the course of a winter, that no one at that table would have had to explain. Most of those dishes are gone now, not forgotten slowly, not replaced by something better, but simply set down one day and never picked back up. These are the 20 forgotten Amish winter suppers that kept entire families full for months and that almost nobody makes anymore. Schnitz und Knepp. Schnitz und Knepp is the one that food historian William Woys Weaver traces to the Upper Rhineland region of Germany, brought to Lancaster County by Palatinate immigrants in the 1680s. It is a one-pot stew built on 3 things: salt-cured ham or pork shoulder, dried apple slices soaked overnight until they plump and soften, and large flour dumplings dropped into the simmering broth at the end. The dried apples are the key. Their tartness meets the salt of the cured pork and the sweetness of brown sugar in a broth that is at once sour, smoky, and rich. It fell away because the schnitzing parties disappeared, community gatherings where neighbors spent entire autumn days cutting and drying apples for exactly this purpose. The broth, tasted on a January evening when the farmhouse smelled of wood smoke and cured pork, carried the whole summer's orchard inside it. Hog maw. The name stops most people before they ask a second question, and that is exactly why it disappeared. In the Pennsylvania Dutch dialect, it is called Saumag, descended from the German Saumagen of the Palatinate, and it has been made in Lancaster and Berks counties since German-speaking Anabaptist refugees arrived in 1683. It is a cleaned pig stomach, packed tight with cubed potatoes, pork sausage, smoked sausage, onions, and parsley, sewn shut and roasted until the skin blisters and splits. The finished maw is sliced crosswise at the table, the filling revealed in a cross-section of potato and meat. Many families considered it bad luck not to eat a piece on New Year's Day. It vanished because the supply chain that made it possible, including the family hog, the home butchering, and the butcher who prepped the maw, was dismantled in 1 generation. The stomach, chewy at the caramelized edges and silky where it pressed against the filling, was the part nobody who had eaten it ever forgot. Duck and sauerkraut. Duck and sauerkraut belongs to the Pennsylvania Dutch tradition of putting 2 things together that seem like they should not work and discovering they work completely. A whole farm-raised duck goes into a covered roasting pan with 2 quarts of sauerkraut, a cup of water, and 3 tablespoons of sugar. It roasts until the skin has gone deep gold and that the cabbage has absorbed every drop of fat the bird releases, the sugar rounding the fermented sourness into something almost jammy. The dish was tied to autumn in Lancaster and Berks counties, when the ducks were ready and the sauerkraut crocks were full. By mid-century, chicken had replaced duck in American home cooking entirely, year-round, cheap, familiar. The Amish families who had duck in their yards and sauerkraut in their cellars were among the last to make this pairing. The skin of a properly roasted duck over sauerkraut develops a crackle that no chicken can replicate. Revel soup. Revel soup is, by any accounting, almost nothing. Milk brought to a bare simmer. Flour, egg, and salt rubbed between the palms until crumbs the size of small peas fall into the broth. Those crumbs, revels, cook in 3 minutes to irregular, soft, slightly chewy dumplings floating just below the surface. The traditional Pennsylvania Dutch cookbook records it without apology. If a housewife had only milk and flour, she could still make revel soup. It was the supper you made when there was nothing to make supper from, appearing as a standalone recipe in Amish community cookbooks across Lancaster County through the mid-20th century. Once convenience soups filled the pantry, rival soup had no reason left to exist. Served hot in a deep bowl with dark bread on the side, it tasted like warmth and salt and something yielding, a simple thing done with enough attention to become real food. Chicken corn soup. Chicken corn soup in its winter form is a different dish from the summer version, and the difference is dried corn. In summer, the soup uses fresh-cut sweet corn. In winter, the corn was dried and stored since August, kernels hard and concentrated, requiring an hour of simmering before they softened and released a deep, almost nutty sweetness that fresh corn cannot produce. Into that broth went hand-rubbed rivels, diced hard-boiled eggs, and pulled chicken from a bird simmered since morning. The dried corn made the winter soup denser, darker, and more complex, and the distinction was understood by every Amish household in Lancaster and Holmes counties. By the 1970s, frozen corn had made drying sweet corn almost entirely unnecessary. The frozen version produced a fine summer soup. It could not replicate what dried corn gave the winter one, but by then almost no one was comparing them. Sauerbraten. Sauerbraten in its Amish farmhouse version is a 3-day proposition. A thick cut of chuck is submerged in equal parts cider vinegar and water using hand-pressed farm cider vinegar, not wine vinegar, and left to marinate in a cool room for 2 to 3 days. On the day of the meal, bacon is tucked into the meat before it goes into the braising pot, and it cooks slowly for hours until the beef is tender in a way only long marination and long cooking can produce. The dish came from the German Rhineland with the Palatinate settlers in the 1680s. It did not survive the shift to midweek family dinners. 3 days of planning cannot compete with 30 minutes. The flavor of the braising liquid on a cold January night, the acid softened by hours of heat and bacon fat threaded through the beef, was the kind of thing that took an hour of cooking to explain. Soos. Soos is head cheese made from pig's feet, and the word alone cleared most dinner tables in post-war America. Pig's feet simmered with onion and celery until the meat fell from the bones. The liquid strained, the picked meat laid into a bowl with cider vinegar, lemon slices, salt and black pepper, and the hot liquid poured over it. Set overnight in a cool room, the collagen firmed to a clear, savory jelly that could be turned out and sliced at the table. Pennsylvania Dutch cookbooks list it as a standard supper preparation, made at hog butchering time in November and December across Lancaster and Berks counties. It vanished as the aversion to gelatin-set meat dishes grew through the post-war decades and family hog butchering disappeared. Souse eaten cold with dark bread and mustard had a texture, firm jelly giving way to soft vinegar-bright pork that most people today have never encountered. They have also never missed it, which is its own kind of loss. Mock duck. Mock duck is a practical joke in the shape of a roast. A thick, round steak is spread with a bread and egg stuffing, seasoned with poultry seasoning and onion, then rolled tight around the filling, tied with string, and slow roasted in a covered pan until the beef has steamed in its own juices and the stuffing has absorbed every drop of the drippings. It appears in the Pennsylvania Dutch traditional cookbook, listed directly alongside recipes for genuine roasted duck. It was made when duck was unavailable, and it was made carefully enough that the distinction did not embarrass anyone. The mock technique was common across German-American farm cooking from the 18th century onward, a response to the seasonal and economic constraints of farmstead life. It disappeared when refrigeration made all proteins available at all times. Mock duck went quietly, sometime in the 1950s, and left a gap in the winter supper rotation that nobody filled. Ham and green beans. Ham and green beans is a dish built entirely on patience. Green beans, often leather breeches dried on strings from the rafters through summer or put up in mason jars from the August harvest, go into a pot with a smoked ham hock. The pot sits on the back of the stove for 2 hours. while the beans absorb the smoke and salt of the hock. The broth darkens, and the ham loosens from the bone. What comes out is not a side dish, but a supper, served in deep bowls with bread to soak the broth, the beans soft to the point of silk. This was the standard winter supper across Lancaster and Holmes County Amish homes for generations. The shift to lightly cooked fresh or frozen green beans changed what this dish was allowed to be. Nobody who has not cooked green beans for 2 hours knows what they actually taste like. They taste like ham. They taste like winter. Umacetti casserole. Umacetti casserole is one of those dishes that sounds invented and turns out to be deeply real. Ground beef and onions browned in a skillet, combined with egg noodles and canned tomato soup layered into a deep baking dish and cooked slow until the noodles have drunk the sauce and the top crust has gone golden and crunchy at the edges. The dish circulated through Amish community cookbooks in Holmes County, Ohio, through the 1950s and the 1960s as a standard potluck offering. If you grew up in Amish country, Ohio, in the mid-20th century, you ate umacetti. What pushed it to the margin was the arrival of globally influenced casseroles through the 1980s. Cookbooks that had once listed umacetti began including lasagna and taco salad. It became old-fashioned in a way that made younger cooks bypass it, and eventually it stopped being taught. The tomato and beef and noodle combination that emerged from that oven was precisely what it needed to be: heavy, hot, and unfussy. Here is a genuine question for anyone watching. Did someone in your family or your neighborhood keep one of these going through the years? A grandparent, a neighbor, someone who still pulled out the pot every January? If there is a dish on this list that you actually ate at a table you remember, leave it in the comments below. These things did not vanish everywhere at once, and the people who held onto them longest deserve to be known. Dutch country bean soup. Dutch country bean soup is the lead soup in the Pennsylvania Dutch traditional cookbook, which is as good a signal of its importance as any. Dried navy beans were soaked overnight, then simmered for 3 hours with a ham bone, the collagen turning the broth thick and gelatinous as the beans dissolved. The result was not a brothy soup, it was a puree, gray-green and dense, that could stand a spoon upright. The U.S. Senate cafeteria has served an almost identical preparation every day since the early 1900s. For Amish families, dried beans were the foundational winter protein, capable of producing a full supper from almost nothing except water, thyme, and whatever bone was saved from Sunday's ham. It declined because the multi-hour cook time that was once simply the rhythm of a farmhouse kitchen became an obstacle in households where no one was home to tend the pot. Canned soup filled the shelf, and the bean pot stopped being taken out. Potato filling. Potato filling is confusing to anyone who did not grow up with it because it appears to be two things at once, and it is. Mashed potatoes are combined with a bread stuffing of cubed stale bread, sautéed onion, celery, parsley, and beaten egg. The two mixtures are worked together and baked in a buttered casserole until the top is golden and firm, while the interior stays dense and soft. It was the starchy centerpiece of Amish holiday dinners in Lancaster County, served at weddings, funerals, and Sunday dinners. It required stale bread planned a day in advance and mashing potatoes before incorporating them into a second mixture. Packaged stuffing mix eliminated the logic of all that effort, and the double preparation became a shortcut nobody took when a single-step alternative existed. The interior of a properly made potato filling, still giving at the center while the edges had set, had a density that no boxed stuffing has matched. Chicken baked in cream. Chicken baked in cream begins with a generous act. A whole chicken is cut into serving pieces, dredged in seasoned flour, then covered in enough whole farm cream to nearly submerge the pieces. 90 minutes in a slow oven. What comes out is not baked chicken in any modern sense. The cream has thickened to a pale sauce around the bird, and the chicken is impossibly tender. This dish relied on one specific condition. A dairy farm in winter produces cream in surplus because butter making slows in cold weather. Using cream as a braising medium is a characteristic detail of Lancaster County farm cooking, documented in the Pennsylvania Dutch traditional cookbook. The dish ended when low-fat dietary guidance through the 1980s made cooking anything in cream seem like recklessness. Home cooks stopped. The difference in the chicken, eaten off the bone with dark bread dragged through the sauce, required no explanation at the table. Fried mush. Fried mush as a winter supper, not breakfast, is the detail most people miss. The Amish distinction was clear. Mush served hot from the pot in a bowl, with cold milk poured over it, was the supper. The leftover mush set overnight in a loaf pan to be sliced and fried in lard the next morning was the breakfast. A 1963 Pennsylvania Folklife magazine article recorded the memory plainly. We considered mush good food for any meal if we did not have company. The supper form fed the family on the coldest evenings, when nothing else was ready, and the fire had been burning since mid-afternoon to keep the pot going. When the cornmeal mush routine left Amish households, it left completely. The supper version required the afternoon preparation, the fried breakfast version depended on. When the pot stopped appearing, both meals disappeared together. Stewed crackers. Stewed crackers is barely a recipe and entirely a supper. Saltine crackers are placed in a bowl and flooded with very hot whole milk, seasoned with butter, salt, and black pepper, eaten immediately before the crackers fully dissolve. They soften but do not vanish and become something between a crouton and a dumpling, warm and starchy in the center. Former Amish community members from Lancaster County have described it as a childhood staple, a supper of last resort made regularly enough to be remembered with genuine affection. It belongs to the Pennsylvania Dutch tradition of using bread products as the starch base for milk-based suppers, documented across Amish homes from the late 18th century onward. Once the condition of having almost nothing became uncommon, the dish had no reason to survive. What it tasted like was warm milk, salt, and the faint sweetness of a soda cracker giving way. Chicken and waffles. Chicken and waffles in Lancaster County is not the dish you know from the American South. In the Pennsylvania Dutch version, the waffle is yeasted, made with lard and buttermilk in a batter that produces a crisp, deep-ridged grid built to hold gravy. Over that waffle goes roasted chicken, not fried, but pulled from a Sunday roast, and a thin chicken gravy from the pan drippings, poured generously across the whole plate. The dish appears in Lancaster County hotel menus from the early 20th century and is documented as a fourth-generation recipe in Bird-in-Hand, Pennsylvania. The Southern version became nationally famous in the early 21st century, and in that rise, the Lancaster County original became invisible. Visitors who ordered chicken and waffles in Amish country assumed they were getting a Southern dish and received something older, stranger, and better suited to a cold Sunday evening. Philadelphia pepper pot. Philadelphia pepper pot is old enough to have appeared on the streets of the city in the 18th century, sold from push carts, and it arrived at the Pennsylvania Dutch winter table through the long relationship between Plain community market sellers and Philadelphia buyers. It is a thick, dark tripe stew with potatoes, dumplings, and marrow bones, seasoned so aggressively with black pepper that the heat builds slowly across the bowl. The traditional Pennsylvania Dutch cookbook lists it as the lead item in its soup section, before bean soup and chicken corn soup, a signal of its historical importance. Tripe's near-complete disappearance from mainstream American cooking after the Second World War, driven by the post-war shift toward muscle cuts, effectively ended this dish outside communities that maintained whole animal butchering. The pepper in a finished bowl of pepper pot was not decoration, it was the point. Creamed dried beef on bread. Creamed dried beef on bread is a dish the military ruined. The Amish version bore the same basic ingredients as the wartime ration called SOS, dried salt beef, white sauce, and bread, but the comparison does a disservice to both the execution and the purpose. In an Amish farmhouse, dried beef was a critical pantry staple, salt-cured and shelf-stable through the coldest months, requiring no refrigeration. Paper-thin slices simmer in a sauce of butter, flour, and whole milk until the salt releases into the cream and the beef curls into tender ribbons, poured over thick slices of homemade white bread. The dish disappeared as refrigeration made dried salt beef unnecessary. Once the beef no longer needed to be preserved through salting, the dish lost its reason for existing. The military version, eaten from a metal tray, has the same components and a completely different outcome. Ham balls. Ham balls with their brown sugar glaze are the Pennsylvania Dutch sweet-sour principle applied directly to meat. Equal parts ground smoked ham and ground fresh pork, combined with breadcrumbs, egg, and milk, are shaped into large balls and arranged in a baking pan. Over them goes a glaze of brown sugar and cider vinegar that blisters and candies as it bakes, producing a lacquered surface on a meat that is simultaneously smoky, sweet, and sour. Ham balls appear consistently in Amish food writing from Lancaster County as a church supper staple, reflecting the Pennsylvania Dutch principle that every rich dish needs something sweet and bright nearby. The dish faded because ground smoked ham is genuinely difficult to source outside Pennsylvania Dutch butchers, and sweetness on a meat dish fell out of step with palates that wanted sweet and savory kept separate. The glaze, still bubbling at the edges when the pan came out of the oven, smelled like the inside of a smokehouse that had been left to the bees. Acorn squash stuffed with sausage is the Amish cellar supper, built from two things that kept without any processing through the entire length of a Lancaster County winter. Acorn squash harvested in October and stored on the cellar floor lasted until March. Loose, fresh pork sausage fills the seed cavity of each halved squash. Brown sugar and a knob of butter go on top, and the halves bake uncovered until the squash edge caramelizes to deep amber, and the sausage fat has run into the brown sugar to form a glaze. The dish appears in the Pennsylvania Dutch traditional cookbook as a main dish, not a side. Acorn squash became a year-round grocery item in the second half of the 20th century, and once squash could be bought fresh in July, it stopped being the thing you planned around in January. The caramelized edge, where the sausage fat had run and the sugar had set, was the last bite you took, and the best one. The families who made all 20 of these dishes were not cooking from nostalgia. They were cooking from necessity, from the ingenuity that comes from having a cellar full of preserved food and knowing exactly what each jar and each crock was going to become by February. The thing that ran across all 20 was the willingness to cook with time. An hour for the mush, 2 hours for the beans, 3 days for the sauerbraten. Time was not the obstacle. Time was the ingredient. If you want to start with one, start with Schnitz und Knepp. Find a ham hock at a good butcher. Buy a bag of dried apple rings, soak them overnight in cold water. The next evening, simmer the ham for 2 hours, add the apples and their soaking liquid, cook another 30 minutes, then drop in the dumplings and cover the pot. In 20 minutes, you will have something that Lancaster County farm families considered unremarkable, an ordinary winter Tuesday, and that tastes like nothing you have made before.